Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre, bringing you conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
In 2018, I went in search of Ketan, and I knew that he had spent his last days in a hospital in a small town in southern Tamil Nadu called Odanchatram, which one of his proteges, A.K. Tarian, had started. A hospital serving the poor people of rural Tamil Nadu. It was the only hospital between Madurai and Coimbatore. And I went there, I knew Ketan had spent his last days there. I was directed to the room where he lived, and it was unoccupied. There was a cupboard, which I pulled open, and all the papers fell out. And fortunately, the trustees of the hospital were gracious enough to say, you take them home, we know you'll make good use of them. Getting your hands on material no one has seen for decades. I think that's often the thrill of historical research.
Rebels Against the Raj tells the little-known story of 7 people who chose to struggle for a country other than their own. Foreigners to India, who from the late 19th century arrived to join the freedom movement fighting for independence. Of the 7, 4 were British, 2 American, and 1 Irish. 4 men, 3 women. Before and after being jailed or deported, they did remarkable and pioneering work in a variety of fields, from journalism and social reform to education, organic agriculture, and environmentalism. Through these entwined lives, in this episode of BIC Talks with historian Ramachanchandra Guha and Ellis, British High Commissioner to India, we receive deep insights into the relationship between India and the West, and India's story as a country searching for its identity and liberty beyond British colonial rule. And now, over to Mr. Ellis and Mr. Guha.
Thank you very much. Good evening and hello, Ram, as well. I didn't know I was going to be grilling, and I'm not much of a chef, so I will try my own form of cooking. It is a pleasure to be asking the questions and not answering them, which is more usually my role as the British High Commissioner. So thank you very much, Ram, by the way, for asking me to do that. It's a pleasure, and I read the book with enormous interest. So I'm actually going to start, Ram, if I may, with the flyer for the event from the BIC, which talks about idealism and sacrifice. What were they chasing, these 7 people? What was that ideal?
I should clarify that the flyer was not written by me. So I might have said stories of idealism, sacrifice, independence, recklessness, stupidity, controversy, etc., etc. The flyer was written by a very decent, God-fearing, spiritual kind of individual. But yes, these people were idealistic and they did sacrifice a lot. Now, I think there were 7 very different individual journeys, Alex, as you would have known reading the book. And they were motivated, of course, partly by political ideology. One was a communist from your old university, Cambridge, Philip Spratt, who no longer was a communist by the time he ended. And I'm delighted to say 2 of his children are here in the audience. Some were spiritually oriented, theosophists, Christians. One was a musician. So they all found their way to India through different routes. But once here, completely identified with our people, our culture, our landscape, and our struggle for freedom. So essentially, if there was a binding ideal to these 7 very disparate and distinctive stories, it would be calling their own people, Western colonialists, to their best ideals and their noblest principles. And hence, that would be what bound them, really. That they were renegades who rebelled against the system of imperialism, of which normally they would have been beneficiaries.
And you make a distinction, I think, in the prologue between these 7 and Charlie Andrews, for example. And you sort of make a distinction there, I think. And tell me a bit more about that distinction. What distinguishes these 7 from some other kind of maybe more middle wayers, perhaps?
So I make a distinction between bridge builders and rebels, or actually renegades. The book was originally titled Renegades, and I had to give up the title because Barack Obama and Bruce Springsteen stole my title. Originally, the book was traveling for a long time under the working title, Renegades, Western Fighters for India's Freedom. The subtitle remains the same. And I came up with the Rebels Against the Raj because I couldn't certainly compete in the marketplace with Obama and Springsteen. And I have a kind of, let me say, obsession with alliterations. So these were rebels or renegades who decisively broke with the colonial state. Now, I distinguish them from bridge builders who were trying to bring the best of the West to the East and the best of the East to the West. So apart from Charlie Andrews, whom you mentioned, who was a personal hero of mine because he was a close friend of Gandhi and Tagore, who did incredible work in drawing attention to the problems of indentured laborers all across the world. I'm, of course, partial to him because he was a teacher in my old college, St. Stephen's. There was other people of that ilk, bridge builders, as it were, included Sister Nivedita, the Irish spiritualist who worked with Swami Vivekananda, after whom so many Indian women are still named, honoring her sacrifice and her idealism, actually. Laurie Baker, a Quaker architect who worked in Kerala, and Verrier Elvin, the subject of my first biography, an anthropologist who worked with tribal people. His abiding regret was that he did not court arrest. He came here in 1927. He was here during the civil disobedience and Quit India movements, and he did not court arrest, and he felt slightly envious and jealous of Magdalene Slade Miraben, whom he knew quite well, who actually went to prison. So in a sense, I thought, let me just focus on people who transgressed completely by either being so radical and so oppositional that they were sent to prison, or in the case of B.G. Honeyman, the journalist, were deported for several years from India.
In some ways, I think Elwin was braver because he took against Gandhi, which I think is a rather braver thing in some ways than going to prison even, actually. But we're not talking about him this evening. So they have an idealism, you say, which is about a transgression, in your words, about fighting for India's independence, effectively. Although he didn't write the flyer, I quite liked it. So the sacrifice then. There was sacrifice. These 7 people feel sacrificed something in different ways, but they definitely sacrificed something.
In my prologue, I distinguish my rebels or renegades from the white Mughals whom William Dalrymple writes about, who are British men, all men in the 18th century, who are enchanted by some aspects of high Indian culture, and as Dalrymple says, took harems, and of course were like Mughals. Now, none of my 7 were remotely like Mughals or took harems. There's a description in my book of a journey in an unreserved train compartment between Madras and Bangalore taken by Philip Spratt. That's not anything any of the white Mughals could have done. And the others too. Sadra Ben living in remotest Uttarakhand, working for gender equality. Kaitan, the American, living in rural Tamil Nadu in a village, working for gender and caste equality, promoting alternative forms of agriculture. They lived very difficult, arduous lives, all of them. I mean, Annie Besant was possibly the exception because she came to an established institution, the Theosophical Society. She lived in a grand building in Chennai, which still exists, and many in the audience have visited. But the others, really roughed it out. They were really, in that sense, they were like many Indian nationalists of that time. If you look at the freedom struggle, if you look at the great figures of the freedom struggle, Subhash Chandra Bose gave up the Indian civil service. Gandhi gave up a prosperous career in the law. Nehru was a very wealthy man who spent many, many years in prison. So all of them were, in that sense, inspired by the idealism and sacrifice of the freedom struggle, except for Annie Besant, lived the kinds of lives generally white people in India do not live. Now or before. There are white people in India today whose names I will not take, who have married into Indian royalty. It could be feudal royalty, political royalty, but they are also kind of white Mughals. All of them, with the possible exception of Annie Besant, really roughed it out. And I think that's the sacrifice part.
They were all idealists and there was sacrifice. And for many of them, I think, it's reading the book, it feels like there's renunciation as well, that they have to renounce something. The transgression requires renunciation of some sort or another. Do you think that's fair?
It's a triple or a multiple renunciation. First, your nationality for another. Then your race. You'll still be white-skinned. You will be identified as English or American, but you identify with people of darker and subordinate races. Well, a comfortable lifestyle for a struggling life on the margins. So it's a kind of a multiple renunciation, is how I would put it. So there were multiple transgressors. That really is what makes their life, that's what unites their life. Though, of course, as I said, each of their lives is distinctive and unique. They do different things. They live in different parts of India. They fight different kinds of struggles. One of the things I found very appealing about them is that they often shone a sharp spotlight on what was wrong with Indian society. They weren't like converts someone who is a fervent communist who becomes a fervent anti-communist, someone who's a fervent Christian who becomes a fervent Hindu and embraces everything about their new faith. So they were not, they were not fellow travelers. I mean, I don't know whether you have seen a book written by the great Chinese historian Jonathan Spence, who died some years ago, one of the great historians of modern China. And he wrote a book about white people who went to China essentially after the revolution and essentially became fellow travelers, devoted loyalists and subjects of the Maoist regime. Now, these people were not like that. They were constantly questioning Indians about how they treated their women, how they abused the environment, how they restricted the freedom of the press. And I think that partly made them, that's what part of the appeal was to me. For a brief period, Miraben was a blind devotee of Gandhi. So she would be the exception again, that, she was so eternally grateful that Gandhi kept her in her entourage, or one might say in his chosen menagerie, where she would peel his oranges, check his bowel movements, take out his spinning wheel. But even she then turned. Then she started doing interesting things. She fell in love. She went off to the Himalaya. So each of them was their own person. And I think that's very nice, because when you identify with another country, you identify with it, warts and all. It's a problem with many people in the world, and not just in India, across the world. People who embrace a new religion or a new nation are often insecure and have to prove their loyalty over and over again. And I think these people that in that way were committed to the broader ideal of Indian freedom, but recognized that there were many things wrong with Indian society.
Do you think that their ideal was India, or do you think that their ideal was more Gandhi's vision for India? Because Gandhi, in a way, feels like the sun around which these planets turn.
Of course, Gandhi was an important figure for all of them, but some of them argued with Gandhi. I think Annie Besant disagreed with Gandhi. Philip Spratt wrote a very insightful left-wing critique of Gandhi, which I talk about at great length. But Gandhi was the preeminent public figure of the day, and he shaped much of what passed for public or political and social discourse, and clearly they responded to him. What was extraordinary about Gandhi? Here I'm quoting the Indian historian Sunil Khilnani, who, when he reviewed my Gandhi biography, said Gandhi was fighting against the British and he was also fighting against India. Now, I wish I had said that in my own book, because that captured the kind of message of my book, my Gandhi biography, so well, that Gandhi was not just fighting the British, he was fighting India for the way they treated their women, the way they treated the untouchables, for the kind of sectarian violence between Hindus and Muslims, for the extraordinary arrogance that a certain kind of entitled Indian had. So Gandhi was fighting the British, Gandhi was fighting India, and so were these people. They were, you could say, consistent with or congruent with the Gandhian vision of a critical rather than unthinking nationalism.
Yes, I agree, and you write well in the book about Besant, who goes through that rather uncomfortable experience of being overtaken by she kind of loses out a bit. Having been there, I think she's the only non-Indian to be in the president of the Congress Party, I think, and sort of gets sort of overtaken by Gandhi. And you write.
Correction, there were other non-Indians. She was the first woman who was a non-Indian. But in the 19th century, some of the early presidents, Wedderburn, for example, was British.
Right. But you do get a sense of her. Yeah, I wouldn't say peak, but Gandhi kind of overtakes her and stakes out a position which she's pretty uncomfortable with. I think. I wouldn't say it was a renunciation. It is not a renunciation of Gandhi, but a feeling this is the wrong way.
It's human nature. If you're successful, you're celebrated, you're adored, you're admired, you're worshipped by the people, and then somebody else comes along. I mean, you see it in Indian politics and British politics. I was reading, if I may say so, an op-ed by a former British Prime Minister yesterday, and he said some very sensible things. But the fact that he was a former British Prime Minister was surely not a serving British Prime Minister. So it's true everywhere. It's true of people in the corporate sector. Someone running a great company, and then somebody young person comes and takes it over. It's true of, I'm sure of great cricketers. Don Bradman is the only guy who retired at the top of his form. Most other great batsmen saw other people overtaking them. So it's very human. And yes, she did feel very much sidelined by Gandhi. She was the matriarch of the freedom struggle. She brought the concept of home rule from a native Ireland to India. And then here comes this lawyer from South Africa who just sidelines her.
He was quite adept at gently pushing people to one side for his cause. would you say that most of these people were in some way or another outsiders or became outsiders? It's interesting how many of them are nonconformists. Of course, very typical in British politics as well, by the way, the nonconformist movement and its influence on politics in the UK. And Miraben she has to renounce the admiralty, as it were. Most of them are natural outsiders in some way. So do you think that's fair?
They're natural outsiders to their society, and they don't become complete insiders to our society either, though they try their best. I think it's extraordinary that out of my 7 subjects, 2 married Indians and 1 almost certainly had Indian lovers. A 4th wanted to have an Indian lover, but the Indian whom she was in love with was not interested in her. Especially because racial boundaries at that time, where interracial relationships were so difficult, so controversial, so frowned upon. They were never blindly loyal to some kind of abstract ideal of Indian nationalism. They wanted India to live up to its best ideals and to reform what needed to be reformed, to embrace modernity and justice and equality, even if it conflicted with traditional cultural norms or spiritual prescriptions. You would always be something of an outsider, wherever you are. I'd say the 2 people who assimilated or indigenized probably more than the others were Ketan and Sarlaben, because they were genuine Gandhians running Gandhian ashrams, living with peasants, like peasants. So this morning, I was at a virtual function honoring Ketan at the Rural University Gandhi ground, which he helped set up. And you can see there, although he's been dead 35 years, he's still revered by ordinary Gandhian social workers. So I think they were possibly the 2 of them, because of the kind of lifestyle they led, probably became more fully Indian, perhaps in that sense. Especially given the asymmetry between the races at that time, however much they identified with India, they would always have felt outsiders to some extent. They abandoned their families. Several of them were very close to their families. 1 or 2 of them lost their families. Ketan's wife and children went away to America. They did live difficult lives, difficult emotional lives as well, not just difficult physical lives.
Yes, you're right about Ketan. Very moving, actually, about how it caused him great difficulty, great struggle when his family went away. Thinking, well, what are those signs of integration? And speaking one of the languages of India is clearly one, and marrying an Indian, definitely another. In one case, in the case of Stokes, converting to Hinduism, which Ketan doesn't actually, if I remember rightly, and he stays a Christian. So those different one would never like to reduce identity to a checklist, but there are sort of degrees of integration which these people take. I want to ask a bit about Horniman, because in a way, he's not a shadow in the book, he's a presence, but he's not as strong a presence as some. And I'd like to hear a bit more from you about him. His writing gives you some material, but his private life remains a quiet thing, probably because of his sexuality.
I write mostly about his public life as a pioneering campaigning journalist who ran a very important paper in Bombay, the Bombay Chronicle, identified with the Indian freedom struggle. His paper carried the first critical reports on the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, for which he was deported by the British and was 7 years out, and then comes back. And then, of course, resumes his career as a journalist, is often quarreling with the authorities, is often in court defending himself, as some Indian journalists are even today, against libel cases. But his sexuality is a shadow. He was clearly gay, but at a time when to be gay was absolutely impossible in public. In fact, in India, in some professions today, although the Supreme Court belatedly but finally decriminalized homosexuality some years ago, in some professions, which include the higher levels of the corporate sector and the higher levels of the civil service, in India in 2022, it's very difficult to be openly gay, if not impossible. Now, here we're talking about 1922. And of course, the British at that time were even more prejudiced against gays. I mean, and you know this from British history right up to the 1960s. So he could never come out. I am told that the British tried to blackmail him. They had some evidence on him, and there's some clues in what I write in the book. But that makes his story moving and poignant. I also speculate that, his deep interest in, for example, ballet and music and literature could be linked to his sexuality, because often gays have a very deeply developed aesthetic sense. There is still a beautiful circle named after him in Bombay. Now, I know you took up office during the time of the pandemic. I don't know whether you've had a chance to visit Bombay and that circle, Alex. Have you?
I have, without realizing that I was near the Horniman bench. I shall go back to it.
It is just, as many people in the audience know, just near the Asiatic Society. It's one of the most beautiful parts of Mumbai. And although 20 years ago, Bombay became Mumbai, all the British names became, Indian and or Maharashtrian names, that still remains. And it's interesting that when my book was published, and some people started reading it, two very distinguished residents of Mumbai, one a retired judge, male judge, one a retired female editor, both told me, who know the Horniman Circle very well. They said, we didn't know who it was named after. We thought it must be some Parsi, Nariman Point, Horniman Circle. All right. Now, because so many things in Mumbai are named after Parsis. Now, I hope people read this book and know more about this extraordinary man. But yes, his sexuality remains. He led a fugitive life, personal life, and left very few traces of it for the biographer to uncover, which is a pity.
You're certainly right about the intolerance of homosexuality in the UK. Although actually, I think pre-Second World War, class solidarity was so deep amongst the upper classes that you could be gay semi-publicly if you were within that group of people. Curiously, something which disappeared, by the way, I think after the Second World War. What did the Raj make of these people?
The Raj had deep reservations about them. They disliked them. Horniman was hated because he was seen as a troublemaker. And when he was deported in 1919, after that, as I described in my book, he was desperate to come back because he loved Bombay, he loved his work in Bombay, and he probably loved a particular resident of Bombay. He was desperate to come back, and he was able to get endorsements, as I quote, from people like H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, the leading writers of the time, George Lansbury, the distinguished Labour leader, and the British Foreign Office was willing to grant him a passport, but the governor of Bombay and the viceroy of India said, we don't want this guy back. He makes too much trouble. Horniman was also quite remarkably a strong advocate of the rights of the working class, which is very unusual. Indian editors were generally middle class, upper class people who didn't care about peasants and working class people. So they refused to give him a passport, and he actually came back illegally. Sarla Ben, when she was arrested in the 1942 movement, I quote how angry the district magistrate of Almora was with her, because, white people in the heyday of the Raj, identifying with the freedom struggle was something they couldn't stomach at all. So, and in that sense, they were not like the bridge builders. Charlie Andrews was an extraordinary man, but his temperament was gentle, understated, non-combative. He was from Cambridge. He was an Anglican, not a non-conformist. So he was a paid-up member of the British establishment, which meant he could have a frugal lunch with Gandhi on Monday and a lavish repast at the Viceroy's house the same night. He was really a bridge builder. But these people, most of them, were treated with great reservation and suspicion by the high officials of the Raj.
The example you give in the book of the British Foreign Office, and of course I have to defend my institution in some way, thinking Horniman can come back, the local power in India, thinking not by local, I mean Raj power. There are echoes of that in many colonial struggles, aren't there? I mean, Montagu in the UK versus some of the viceroys. You had it all over the world. The local power, then the power in London, then the church and the merchants all battling with each other over these issues. The Scramble for Africa, a wonderful book, has great pieces about exactly that. But those dates are interesting, 1919 and 1942, Raman. I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, because one's just after the First World War, the other's in the middle of the Second World War. And in a way, both those times, identity was being forced hard at you. Which side are you on? Particularly 42, I think. And you sort of had to choose in 42, didn't you, where you were?
In my Gandhi biography, I go at great length into the torment that Gandhi and Nehru faced. Because Gandhi and Nehru were both, you could say, alert and wise enough to recognize that however bad the British were, Hitler and the Japanese were much, much worse. That they could see. I mean, unlike some other Indians who chose Hitler and the Japanese over the British. They could see that. And yet they wanted their own freedom. And so they were kind of a torment. But I don't want to talk much about my earlier writings. But one of the things that happened during the Second World War was that Gandhi broke with his closest English friend, who was a Jew called Henry Pollack, who was his closest friend in South Africa. But when Gandhi launched the Quit India movement, Pollack felt, as a Jew, knowing what Hitler and the Nazis were doing to the Jews, he felt Gandhi had kind of lost it to oppose the British at this point of time. So you're quite right. 42 was the British had their backs in the wall and they were fighting for their own freedom. Of course, one wishes that there'd been a more sympathetic viceroy in India at that time. The Scotsman Linlithgow was one of the most dour, unimaginative, probably stupid viceroys the British have ever had. So that probably complicated matters, and his views percolated downwards, along with the views of the arch-imperialist Prime Minister Winston Churchill. But absolutely, in 1942, because there would be every British officer in India would have had a brother or a cousin fighting on the front, probably dying. One can sympathize with how some of them felt.
And it's interesting in the book, I think both Miraben and Stokes write about this during the Second World War, and as it were, say, come on, the Orisons were not very impressed by it. Was it Miraben who tells them that they've all got to support, they've got to fight the Japanese, and the sense that actually there's quite a lot of distance between Stokes and Miraben and the popular feeling within India, is that fair to say?
Stokes was an American who worked in Himachal, was part of the non-cooperation movement, went to jail, and in 1924 left politics to promote horticulture. He grew some of the first apples in Himachal, laying the foundations of a multi-million-dollar industry, and of course on social work and schools. And in the summer of 1939, after being out of touch with Gandhi for a decade, he writes him an incredibly insightful letter saying there's a war coming in Europe, and it's between a declining imperial power and a rising aggressive imperial power, and actually saying what I've just said, that no imperial power in recent history has been as barbaric and brutal as the Nazis, and you have to set aside your doctrinal commitment to non-violence, and the Congress must side with the British. And then he goes on to say, in the summer of 1939, the war will come, it will be a long, protracted war, and at the end of it, if the Nazis win, God help India and the world. If the British win, they'll be so exhausted that they'll have to give up their colonial possessions. Incredibly prescient letter. And I had a wonderful editor for this book. My main editor was a great American editor called Dan Frank of Knopf, and my book was one of the last books he edited, and he died some months ago. And he would really take the blue pencil to my books. My Gandhi biography is long enough, but Dan Frank cut out 80,000 words from that. All right, which is a book by itself. And from this book, Rebels Against the Raj, or Renegades that it was called, Dan Frank cut out 20,000 words from the copy that you've read. But he said when he came to the Stokes letter, do not cut a word of this. Because it's such an extraordinarily moving and prescient letter. To understand how evil the Nazis were and to predict that the war would be long, bruising, and would exhaust the British, and it would exhaust them so much that they would have to grant freedom anyway. So it's really a wonderful letter, and I was glad to have my editor's permission to quote it at length.
It is a terrific letter, I agree. 1919, I guess, was a sort of different time, but again, I guess that feeling of tremendous disappointment that what might have happened after the First World War didn't happen. Interestingly, I thought a lot about Ireland as I was reading that part of the book, actually, because there's some parallels with Irish history and the way the First World War sort of stopped what was probably going to happen in Ireland. But there was a kind of more clear cut, and Horniman is he's a journalist, so he gets into the story, doesn't he? But this is very obvious that this is the wrong way to go. And in that sense, he was expressing an opinion which would have been widely held, I guess, at the time.
1942 is more complicated, you're right. Because 1919, the war had ended. 1942 was the middle of the war. And this massacre had taken place, and the British were trying to hush it up. The Punjab, where the massacre took place, was also the province from which so many soldiers had come in the First World War. So many Indian soldiers had served in different parts of Europe and the Middle East who had come from the Punjab. He was a journalist, as you said, he got a report, he published it. But he had a conscience. He knew something horrible had happened at Jallianwala Bagh on that day. And after he goes back to England, after he's deported, he writes a book on the massacre and its aftermath with a very beautiful title. It's addressed to a British public, and it carries the title, Amritsar and Our Duty to India. And I think that tells you something about how he's awakening the British people to their own moral conscience. And possibly Ireland was at the back of his mind. I think Ireland was certainly maybe part of what he was trying to say, because partial power had already been devolved to Ireland. Home rule had come. I think independence was to come. shortly afterwards. And again, as you point out, I think Edwin Montagu, who was the Secretary of State, was more alert to what Indians wanted than the officials in India itself.
Or perhaps he wasn't quite as invested in the structures of power as he would be if he were on the ground, I guess. Some of the people you write about lived for quite a long time after the great moments. The ideal hasn't been realized, but they think it's been realized, by 47. And we might talk about Philip Spratt a bit. So he's an example of somebody who lives a long time afterwards. And also change evolves over time in his attitude, having been identified as a risk quite early on, actually, after university, I think, with some rather rude remarks about the quality of his degree. But he would be an example of somebody whose approach does change over time, it's fair to say.
I'm glad you noticed the rude remarks that the master of Downing College made about the quality of his degree, because somewhere in the archives of the St. Stephen's College is a report by the principal of that college about my degree with very similar remarks. So I was quite happy. I was quite happy to see that, actually. Pratt is a communist. He goes to jail. In jail, he starts reading Gandhi, becomes a recovering communist, then joins the halfway house of the late former revolutionary M.N. Roy, and then moves further rightward. Pratt's journey is, if I may invoke John Maynard Keynes, who is supposed to have said, when the facts change, I change my mind. And how about you, sir? I think Pratt was reading what was happening in the Soviet Union. And he saw that his original ideal of a classless utopia brought about by a Bolshevik party was nonsense, would only lead to more brutality and tyranny. Maybe he went too much the other extreme. I'm sympathetic with much of what he wrote in the 50s and 60s, and particularly with his early criticisms of Nehru's license permit quota Raj. But I think he went overboard in supporting America and Vietnam. But it's quite impressive that as an Englishman in India, he's not afraid to take on a very popular and dominant government and prime minister on their political views and their foreign policy practices. And he lives on to the 1970s. And so do some of the others. Khaitan dies in 1984, well into Indian independence. So all of them really contribute quite a lot to independent India as well as to the struggle against the Raj.
Spratt also has my second favourite quote from the book, which is, I have always looked upon the law as the deadliest and dullest of subjects, but it must be bright and fascinating compared to grammar. There's others also live for quite a long time. Saralaben lives for quite a long time afterwards. And they too have their own, if not disillusion, they're still fighting for an ideal, I guess, and are frustrated by it. Is that fair to say?
If you look at the economic policy that India adopted in the 50s and 60s, behind which there was a massive consensus. All economists, at bar one or two in the 1950s, believed India must industrialize with the state playing a commanding role. Now, the two kinds of dissenters, one were the free marketers, of whom Spratt and the Swatantra Party were sort of emblematic, and the other were the precocious environmentalists, who were inspired by Gandhi's remarks that Western industrialization and consumerism had been enabled by the West's control over vast parts of the globe through colonialism. And for both moral and pragmatic reasons, were advocating a responsible stewardship of natural resources. And I think that kind of environmental edge to the writings of Miraben, Sarlaben, and Khaitan, I think is incredibly relevant to India today. The free marketers are one, but the free market can take care of many things. It can take care of entrepreneurship, innovation, but it can't take care of the environment. If you take out restraints and laws and regulations, you have what's happening in Delhi today with the air you're breathing. When you go out, I'm sure you have a purifier in the beautiful bungalow behind you, but when you go out to the street, you'll face the problem that the reckless abuse of the environment brings. All our cities, including Delhi, were sited on rivers, but the Jamuna, as you know, is biologically dead. A quite remarkable Delhi environmentalist who died some years ago, Anupam Mishra, once said, who worked on water, once said, if on Independence Day it was obligatory that instead of making a speech from the Red Fort, the Prime Minister took a dip in the Jamuna, you'd have a very different kind of river. I started my career as an environmental scholar and an environmental historian, so I'm happy rather late in life to return to these figures who talked about the challenges we'd face on the environmental front in the 50s and 60s, a long time ago.
I was ambassador in Brazil. So there too, I think there was a very strong reaction against exploitation, commercial exploitation by outsiders. And that can sometimes throw up a tension over environmentalism when it seemed like the West imposing a kind of new form of control over ex-colonies. It's interesting to me that actually in environmentalism, some of the things which have worked best have been market mechanisms of one sort or another applied to environmental ends. And of course, we've just been out of the Glasgow climate change conference. Go back on the identity issue for a second, because an interesting detail actually is Sarah Labin, if I remember rightly, is a non-Indian for a while. She's frightfully annoyed because she can't go back to, is it Himachal, I think, because she's a non-Indian.
Uttarakhand.
Because she's a non-Indian. So those identity issues, they remain.
Sprat, of the 4 who stay on after 47, 3 die before. Miraben leaves in 59. Ketan becomes an Indian citizen. Sprat becomes an Indian citizen. Miraben stays a decade and then goes back to Austria. Sarla is kind of enchanted with the idea of a world citizen. She sees herself as a citizen of the world. Now, which is kind of problematic. It's utopian and nice, but I personally have always rejected it because I believe that one of the chief duties of a citizen is to be a nuisance to his state. And there is no world state. In that sense, she had this ideal, did not take an Indian passport, and after the Chinese aggression of 1962, was restricted from traveling in the interior parts of Uttarakhand, which she knew so well and loved so deeply. And once that happened, she reluctantly changed to an Indian passport. But that was because of this idealism, that there's a world citizen, we'll be world citizens. But I think that obviously is not something that is at all practical.
Just thinking about that, I dug out the quote, the spiritual need for patriotism and the military values for which, however a little the boiled rabbits of the left may like them, no substitute has yet been found. George Orwell, of course, writing exactly at the time when you had that tension about which side are you on, and wars certainly do provoke that. Are you one of these people, Ram, in your sort of outlook of life?
I'm an Indian patriot, not an Indian jingoist. I've written a long essay on the difference between patriotism and jingoism. And one of my collections of essays carries an epigraph by the great Irishman who lived most of his life in America, Benedict Anderson, one of the world's foremost scholars of nationalism, whom I was privileged to know. And he says that a true nationalist draws attention to the crimes of his own state. And I would say to the crimes of his own people. I think that's where Gandhi comes in. It's important to draw attention to the crimes of your government. But it's easier than drawing attention to the crimes of your own people. The kind of herd mentality, the kind of consensus around treating a certain section of society as inferior, which is so much part of the cultures of many countries in the world. I think in that sense, many of the subjects of my book were Indian patriots rather than Indian nationalists or jingoists. And Miraben writes at the time of the China War, she writes to her Gandhian colleagues that I'm dismayed by your jingoism and your hatred for China. But actually, between India and China, it's a complex border with many problems on both sides. I think unthinking nationalism and jingoism is dangerous. Orwell gets it exactly right. Orwell, I think, knows what he loves about England, which is the countryside, the literature, the fish and chip shops. But he defended against Germany, but he would not defend the brutalization of the working class. Orwell was not, in that sense, very sensitive to gender questions. But if he was, I don't think he would defend some of the inequalities within British society at all. Or today, how do you deal with immigrants? I think these are things Orwell would have raised as a proper patriot.
He was quite brusque about vegetarianism, if I remember rightly, but that's a story for another time. Of your citizens of the world, I might put Miraben in there. I mean, she was a great romantic. It was, forgotten the name of the French author. Then it's Gandhi, and then she falls in love, and then it's Beethoven. In a way, she was a kind of absolute perfect early 19th century romantic, deeply attached to a series of different figures, rather than, say, one country.
Absolutely. So it was Beethoven, and then it was Gandhi, and then it was Beethoven again. But a little bit of Gandhi still stayed with her. But yes, he was in that sense very much an old-fashioned romantic.
What did you most enjoy about researching and writing this book? What was the fun bit?
A lot of it was fun. I think there's 7 such unusual, fascinating characters. I say in the epilogue to my book, or in the acknowledgements, most of my books have been based on archival materials in public repositories. You know, the British Library, the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, the National Archives of India, the National Archives of the UK, the Library of Congress. different kind of provincial archives, Cambridge University, South Asia collection. Here I was able to get, for at least 4 out of 7, papers in family hands. Spratt's letters to his wife, Ketan's letters to his American friends, Miraben's personal correspondence, which one of her disciples handed over to me. So that was really nice. I'm not one of those who puts himself in his books, how I went about the research. But since this is a public conversation and the book is out, let me share a story. In 2018, I went in search of Ketan, and I knew that he had spent his last days in a hospital in a small town in southern Tamil Nadu called Odanchatram, which one of his proteges, A.K. Tarian, had started. A hospital serving the poor people of rural Tamil Nadu. It was the only hospital between Madurai and Coimbatore. And I went there. I knew Ketan had spent his last days there. I was directed to the room where he lived, and it was unoccupied. There was a cupboard, which I pulled open, and all the papers fell out. And fortunately, the trustees of the hospital were gracious enough to say, you take them home, we know you'll make good use of them. Getting your hands on material no one has seen for decades. I think that's often the thrill of historical research. The writing I really enjoyed. I have not enjoyed writing a book as much as I have this one, not even my cricket books. It just came out. And of course, I quoted, as I said, too much. And my editor, Dan Frank, had to cut out hell of a lot. But fortunately not Stokes' letter. It's one of the books I've really enjoyed writing and researching. And particularly because Ali Besant and Miraben apart, the others are really unknown even to most Indians.
I was trying to remember a quote from Auden. Private faces in public places are wiser and nicer than public faces in private places. And in a way, I think your book shows a bit of that. Thank you, Ram.
Thank you, Alex. And I'll ask you to send me the whole epigraph from Auden, and I'll steal it for use somewhere else with proper attribution to Auden and to you. Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for staying on for the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, please share it with family and friends. You can also leave us a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. The crew that makes these podcasts possible are Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghavendra Tenkaila. Artwork and design is by Chandani Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studios. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. Do follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter to get regular updates on our programming. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.